Welcome to the latest Mosaic Coffee Breaks. On this occasion, we have another special guest, Bob Spence, who will be talking all things virtual marketing. Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning, all.
Tea today.
Right. So, Bob, let's get a bit of an intro from you first off. Just tell us a bit about yourself, thumbnail sketch, and then we'll go into grilling you, so to speak.
All right, fair enough. Well, I think it's no secret that I'm not British. I guess that's a giveaway. My background's rainmaking. I'm a business development specialist, educated and brought up in the Southern Hemisphere, but educated in banking in London. And I did probably the most recognisable brand. I did a stint as the rainmaking lead for Coutts Bank the Strand, and I went into that role just after the banking crash. So the scenario we enjoy right now for business development, there are some parallels. But business development, I've been lucky enough to be working with Barry through a mutual introduction. But I'm hoping on this little session I can give some different perspective, because in the Southern Hemisphere, a lot of stuff has been done virtually for a much longer. I can certainly share that South Africa, which is where I'm from, literally jumped onto Skype immediately for a whole variety of reasons. So I
think that's very much our focus, in that it's what does the lockdown we've had, what does it mean to a change in our marketing approach? I think we're all used to this, but yes, give us some of the benefit of your past experience and what you think we should all be doing now.
But also, I think in terms of this, we've all got quite used to this, and we're doing this, but I'm sure there's some tips that would enable us to do this better.
Yes.
Well, I think in the first instance, which is probably the hardest part, it is to try and see it from the client's point of view, because although we're quite familiar with it operationally and what it may or may not mean to how we, communicate, to a big chunk of the clients, they're not used to it, and so we have to take a lead. And then you've got different variants. You kind of got the one-to-one through a camera, and that's not so different than being together. But then you've got two variants. You've got the 1-to-2, which is when I'm talking to two of you, and then you've got the 2-to-1, where I'm the prospect or client, and there's two lawyers speaking to me, and they perform differently. And then as soon as you get up to 4, all bets are off, because unless you're relatively skilled at what you're doing, anything can happen. And I'm kind of curious, as a Southern Hemisphere guy, how people have kind of jumped onto this without really considering, it's just not the same. It's just not the same. But the thing is about it that the things you can do differently are things that you can learn. They're not, you don't, in fact, in a way, the webcam's a great leveler. I'm thinking of a pal of mine, a big friend of mine who does wealth management over in America, and he's got everything going for him. I tell you, he's like 6'2", which I'm not. He's kind of got a bit of a Timothy Dalton thing going on. If you remember him as James Bond.
Yep.
Yeah, and to make it even worse, he's got a bit of a Richard Burton thing happening as well with his voice. I think if you're a rainmaker, you would fear him. 6'2" guy, looks like James Bond, sounds a bit like Richard Burton, and he's a great guy as well. But of course, through a webcam, he loses so much of that.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things, Bob, is a little bit of do as I say, not as I do here. But one of the things that I know you've tried to impress on me is that once you start getting Zoom meetings of any size, you actually need to have some pre-agreed rules of engagement and behavior and all that side of thing. Otherwise, they can descend into chaos pretty rapidly, as we're about to prove, probably.
But you're right there, because there's no kind of etiquette. I mean, I'll share a couple of angles on it and see what you make of it. Certainly with the legal practitioners I'm working with, I say preparation's everything. You've got to get out there. It's pretty basic stuff. Get out there in advance what this call is going to be like. That's the first thing. So get an agenda, and rather than have one agenda that breaks into 4 units, have 4 agendas that build one thing, because it's easier to manage 4 things that make one thing than one thing broken into 4. So I said, prepare it. Let the people coming on the call know what to expect. Secondly, don't manage the call yourself. Have one of your team actually managing the IT. Make sure you're not the person that's having to do that. And there are certain little things that you can do on top. I mean, first of all, if you're using Zoom, for example, induct people into the technology. Do not presume that people know how to use Zoom or Teams or anything, in fact. So maybe have the first 5 minutes of any meeting. So I'd be going, okay, what we're going to do now, Barry, I'm going to spend the first 5 minutes just doing a 360 around how this technology works. If this is new information, it's a good job I'm doing it. If it's old information, it's just a double check. And no one's going to complain about that. And most people will be doing happy that you've done that. And as you do that, that kind of replaces the bit where you were walking them from the reception table, or you're making someone a coffee, or you're meeting someone by the lift, where you make that little bit of small talk and you make that connection. Well, now make that connection by inducting them into how this technology works. And then you might do things like, well, if I'm going too fast, just put something in the chat box. If you want to raise attention with me, put something in the chat box. Now, here's the thing. If you get people using the chat box and you've got someone managing the call, that's a lot easier than people cutting in, because the challenge with people cutting in is the audio track might bounce dependent on the voice over internet connection. So get people to be using the chat box rather than raising their hand or speaking.
What sort of numbers, Bob, do you feel you need to move to that chat box? We're obviously 5 now. Can you do 5? Does it need to be? What sort of numbers?
I would go 4 and upwards.
Right.
If it's a client meeting, yeah.
I think the chat box is key. I've run some board meetings with one of my other hats on, and we tried it with, once we mastered the chat box, life was so much easier, because I was sharing them, then come back and say, okay, you get to a break, Bob's raised this point, Nigel's raised that. And the other interesting thing, there's a couple of occasions where someone types something in, what about this? And somebody else answers it, and the whole thing's put to bed without interrupting what's going through. So the chat box to me has been the biggest learning point.
Man, I couldn't back you up any further on what you've said. If you can get the chat box cooking, it really gives another environment for the communication channel for the call. And that is such a great case study that someone's put in a point and then someone else has covered the point. And that happens. The chat box is the secret weapon for the lawyer in a call. And I mean, I appreciate you've just said you use it. Hardly anybody engages with the chat box. But
that's true. I very rarely do so. The biggest one I've used, and not with Zoom, but virtual conferencing, was with 50 odd people presenting a lecture jointly with somebody else. And we didn't really often use the chat box. And in fact, we tried to encourage people to use the chat box, but they wouldn't. In fact, we had hardly any engagement at all, 50 odd people without the cameras on, and we were just lecturing straight into the void. And that was desperately difficult. And it would have been far, far better to have had some interaction.
Yeah, well, I think Bob's got a number of tools that you can add on, merge with the likes of Zoom and Teams, which enable you to keep people's attention there. Because I think one of the issues is it's so easy for people to mentally wander off, isn't it?
Well, that brings us to the end of part 1 of all things virtual marketing with Bob Spence. Just leaving you in the air, watching out for part 2 for the tools to use to make your virtual marketing more effective. Watch out for part 2 coming to a laptop near you shortly.